welcome to Pay It Forward. I've got a quick demonstration video for you today. I'm going to show you how to sew the stab back stitch, which is a great hand sewing stitch. It's the strongest stitch you can use for hand sewing, soft sculpture, little soft toys and so on, and I think you're going to find it really useful. So let me show you how it's done. Now before I actually demonstrate this stitch, let me show you how and when I would actually use this one. So I've got here little Mork and Mindy, my two little Boston Terrier art dolls. Now in my own work here, I still use this stitch. I still hand sew all of their heads and all of their little tight areas like their hands and their feet with this particular stab back stitch. Now when I first started out in this industry many years ago, I was in an area way up north in Australia, a very remote area. I had very limited access to resources and you know, information about the industry that was very young then, and I certainly had I had 6 little children, and hence I had you know, very low funds, and so I had no sewing machine at all. So I learnt to sew by hand using this stitch, and my early work, and definitely many of my award-winning teddy bears and art dolls and so on were all sewn by hand using this stitch. So many of you may know this stab back stitch already. If you do, that's awesome. Perhaps this video might help you just polish up on that stitch. And if you haven't used this stitch before, it's a great a little stitch to have in your skill set. So you're going to need it moving forward. I will be bringing out a few more little patterns for you, and certainly things like making a basic bear. This stitch is what you're going to need for sewing in things like foot pads, little head gussets like this, where our stitching needs to be nice and perfect and nicely rounded. So let me show you how it's done. So here I have my 2 pieces of fabric. It's felt fabric, and we're going to join them together with the stab back stitch. You can see that first of all I have just overcast that edge just to tack it together, and I would normally do that when I'm using the stab back stitch, because I would be sewing a little animal's arm or leg or headpiece, and I really don't want my pieces to move. So I would tack that one into place first of all. It's easier to do this stitch without pins in the way. And I have a medium-sized darner, which is just a fairly fine darner, and I have my extra strong Gutermann thread, and I have a knot in the end. Now when you're hand sewing any little 3D item, whether it be a toy or home decor or anything like that, you should use, when you're doing this stitch, you should use an extra strong thread, because it's just that one line of stitching and it works much better. The thread holds together better. So we're going to start at the back of the fabric, and we're just going to come in, and first of all on this section I'm going to show you this stitch in supersize. So we're going to imagine that our seam is going to run across here. So I've come in from behind, and I'm going to make my first stitch, which is actually going to be huge compared to what it would be, but I really want you to be able to see this little stitch. I'm going to come back to the point where I started, just to anchor that first stitch in. You can see that one there. And then when we're working with a stab back stitch, we're always coming from behind. So our next stitch is placed further along from behind. We go through both layers, we pull our needle all the way through, then we're going to go back into the same hole that we just came out of and pull that one nice and firm. We're going to move along, we're going to come up from behind again, pull those stitches nice and tight, and then we're going to go back into that same hole that we came out of. And again, You can see that what's happening is this stitch is completely linked all the way. There's no spaces, there's no gaps, and it's also stitched the same from the other side. So you can see it's very similar to sewing a seam on a sewing machine that has the bobbin thread underneath, and it sews both sides. This is absolutely the strongest stitch for hand sewing, and you can see because it's linked that way, it's easy to follow a curve and follow a shape. Now that's it in supersize. So I hope you've been able to see that really well. So it's in from the back and through back into the same hole you came out of. Now I'm going to show you in a regular size. We have the same 2 pieces of fabric, and we're going to do what I have here, a little 4mm seam allowance, and my stitches are also just about 4mm. You can see I'm coming in from behind and I'm diving back into the little hole that I just came out of. Coming from behind again and back into that same hole each time. And depending on the size of your project, if you're working on smaller pieces, you can bring the size of those stitches right down to quite tiny when you're making little tiny things, or perhaps just going around a tight little curve, and you won't have any of that stop and start sort of look in a seam that you get when you're using the sewing machine, because you're purposefully linking each stitch back into the end of the first one. So you can see there, once you get going, you can actually, you know, once you've been doing this stitch for a while, it can be quite quick. But just remember, it's all the way in both layers and stabbing all the way through. And you can see that that little stitch is as straight from behind as it is on top there. This stitch is not to be confused with a regular back stitch, which I'll show you quickly now so that you can see the difference. So a regular back stitch is used more widely in sewing finer fabrics in dressmaking, and of course I'm using a heavy duty thread here because so that you can see it. Usually you would use a finer machine sewing thread. So normal coming in from behind with a knot in behind. The back stitch, classic back stitch, is just going in from behind, but you're working from the top. So you take your stitch a little further along, and we're working from the top. We're not going all the way through the fabric and then back through again. We're coming somewhere close to where we first came out, and we're traveling along and then back, which is why it's called a back stitch, because we're working backwards, back on ourselves. And back. So it's not completely linked like the stab back stitch, and I find that it also it's not as secure as the stab back stitch, because there's more pull in the stitches, which means you can get more puckering with this one. And also I find that as you're negotiating your needle through each time, you're having to bend that fabric, and it means that your fabric pieces can move and shift, and we really don't want that when we're sewing something 3D. So this is a great stitch for sewing clothing and garments and that sort of thing by hand. But we go back to our back stitch and we've got that lovely, really secure, I'll show you, even though that's black thread, that's a very, very firm and it's a great strong finish. And even though that's black thread, it's very hard to see. So I hope you're going to find that really, really useful and look forward to using it in my upcoming patterns. Well, thank you for watching today. I have you all armed and ready with your stab back stitch now, ready for my new patterns that are coming soon. Make sure that you subscribe so you don't miss any of those. If you have enjoyed this video, perhaps you could give me a thumbs up. That would be absolutely beaut. In the meantime, everybody, if something good comes your way, remember to pay it forward. And until our next video together, it's hooroo from me.